Masechet Menaḥot Daf Lamed Gimel Ve'amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shemuel Ketaba al Shene Dapin Pesula. So more laws about Mezuzah, again in the name of Rav Yehuda, in the name of Shemuel. If one writes a Mezuzah on two, daf in modern Hebrew means a page or a separate sheet. But as we saw above, daf in the Gemara means a column. So if one writes a mezuzah on two columns, it is not good. And nowadays, we in fact write it in one column, one paragraph right under the other. Me'etibe ketaba al shene dapin v'hinicha b'shne sipin pesula. We have bedaf echad keshera. We have a baraita that seems to contradict Shemuel because it says if you write a mezuzah on two columns and you place it on two different doorposts, on each one paragraph on one page and the other on a different page, and you put them on two doorposts, it's no good. So here daf still means columns, but it means that you put one column on one page and another column on a different page, a different parchment, and then you separated them and attached one to each doorpost. Now that is no good, but we can infer from this braita that if you take two separate pages and attach them to one doorpost, then it would be okay. In other words, if you write it in two columns, as long as the two columns are together, that's okay. And the answer is, no, what this means is as long as if it's fitting to be on two different doorposts. In other words, this baraita, when it says, if you write it on two pages and place it on two doorposts, it's not only pasul if you actually put them separately, one on the right doorpost and one on the left doorpost, even if it's fitting to be written, to be placed on two doorposts, meaning that's on two separate pieces of parchment. That is not good, even if you place them together on one doorpost, but if it's two separate parchments, it's not good. But that is okay with Shemuel. What Shemuel was talking about is if you write it on two columns, but two columns in such a way that you couldn't possibly put it on two doorposts. What would that be? That would be if it's two columns on the same parchment. Okay, so in summary, according to Shemuel, one is permitted to write the mezuzah on two columns as long as it's on the same parchment, so they're not separable. You couldn't possibly put them on two different doorposts. So you put Shema on one column and then Vaya on the next column, or whatever. You continue from one column to the next. That is valid. And the halacha l'maaseh, in fact, we write it always in one column, but according to Rambam, if you would write it on two columns, it would still be valid. But it has to be on the same sheet. If you put it on two different pages, then since that could be separated, that is not valid. Ve'amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shemuel b'mezuzah halech achar heker sir. Another law that Rav Yehuda says in the name of Shemuel, when it comes to mezuzah, you follow the indication of the hinge. The mezuzah has to be put on the right side as you're walking into a room or into a house. Now, sometimes that's very clear. If you're talking about the front door of a home, you're coming in from outside and you're walking in, you put it on the right side as you're walking from outside to inside. But there are some cases where it's not clear. For example, you have two rooms within a house and it's not clear, is this one called the outside, you're walking into this room, or the other way around? So if you want to find out which is the right side, which is called the outside and the inside room, follow the hinge of the door. My heker sir, what does that mean? Follow the sign of the hinge. Amar Rav Ada abakta. Rav Ada says the socket. In those days, unlike today, our hinges are on the side of the door, attached to the door post. However, in those days, they had swinging doors where you'd have a socket on the floor and on the floor where the door is, and another socket up in the lintel. And so then the door would swing on protrusions that would go into the socket down and into the socket above, and the door would swing that way. Now, these doors were not in the middle of the doorway, but rather on one edge or another. And so you'd either put it all the way here on this corner, or like it is here on this corner. So let's say it's a foot wide, so you have to look at where is the hinge, and you could look at the floor and see where is the hole in the floor that would be the socket for that hinge. hinge around which the door would swing. And the idea is that the socket is always on the side of the inside room. And so that would make sense here. Let's say this was the outside, and now you're going into this room. So yeah, the hinge is on the inside of the wall. And so if it was two rooms next to each other, then the one that has the hinge on its side, or the socket in the floor on that side, that's called the inside room, and therefore it would be like this is the outside room, and you put the mezuzah on the right side as you're walking in to that room. And now we explain hechidami, what would be a case where this would be relevant that we couldn't figure out otherwise. Kegon pitcha de ben tere bate ben be gabre lebe nashe. For example, if you had an entranceway between two houses and or between a room for men and a room for women. There's two, let's say, buildings that are connected next door to each other, or two rooms within a house, and there's one area for men and one area for women. And maybe there's separate entrances that the men would come into and the women would go into from outside. And then in the middle, those two rooms are connected by a door. So now these are equal rooms. It's not like it's an entranceway to another room or anything like that. They're equal rooms. They're both connected to the outside. So it wouldn't be clear which is the outer and inner room, which one do you go into and out of. So you look at the socket, and the one that has the socket on its side is the inner room. Resh galuta bena beta amar le Rav Nachman kebat li mezuzta amar Rav Nachman tele dashe beresha. And this halacha is relevant to the following story, where the Resh galuta, he built a new home. He was very rich. I'm sure it was a very nice big home with many rooms. And he told Rav Nachman, can you put the mezuzot up? And Rav Nachman said, first, put the doors in, and then I'll put the mezuzot. Why? Because he needs to know where the doors go in order to figure out which way is the outside room and the inside room. He probably had a very big mansion and had many inner rooms that connect to each other. So if it's a small house, you just go by the front door. The front door is the first room, and then you can follow through. The next door is inner, and the one inside from that. But if it's a home with a lot of rooms, then you might not be able to tell which is an inside room and outside room. So he said, put the doors up, and then I can see where the doors are, and I'll see if that door and the socket is on one side. I'll know that's the inside room, and I'll know which side to put the mezuzah on. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav Asa'a kemin neger pesula. Rav Yehuda teaches in the name of Rav that if one made the mezuzah like a door bolt, it's invalid. A door bolt, imagine a lock on the door, in the middle of the door, and when you lock it, the door bolt goes into the door frame, into the jamb, sideways. So if you just look at the bolt itself, it's a horizontal piece of metal. So imagine if you would drill a hole into the wall, into the door frame, into the jamb, and then you'd stick the mezuzah in there horizontally. That is no good. And so the idea is that the mezuzah cannot be horizontal. In this picture here, they put it also horizontally, but this way across the width of the door. But actually, a bolt is probably more like it's going inside the doorway. So either way, making it horizontal is not valid. It's not considered honorable to prefer to be lying down like that. Ini veha ki ata Rav Yitzchak bar Yosef amar kuluhu mezuzta debe Rabbi kemin neger havu abidan vehi pitcha de ayil be Rabbi lebe midrasha la hava la mezuzah. We have a contradiction from the following story that when Rav Yitzchak bar Yosef came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, he reported two laws that he said all of the mezuzot in the house of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, not two laws, but two practices of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, which we assume are authoritative, that he did things the right way. Because all of his mezuzot are like door bolts. So that means it must be okay. And the second practice is that he had the entranceway by which he came into the Bet Midrash did not have a mezuzah. Okay, we'll talk about that law separately. But right now we see that he made them as door bolts, so that means the door bolt mezuzah is okay. So how can we reconcile this? La kashya, hada abida kesichta, hada abida keistevida. There's no problem. problem. When we said that it's not good, when the Rav said it's not good, that's talking about when it's like a peg. Imagine a peg that you stick into the wall horizontally, sideways into the wall. That's what it means that it's not good. That's what Rav was talking about. However, when we said that a Yehuda Nasi makes his also like a bolt, not that kind of bolt, but rather something like an ankle. Now, an ankle is a curious analogy. It's quite a difficult analogy, because an ankle, what is it referring to? Is it referring to this part of the ankle, right? These bones that are vertical, or ones that are on an angle, or the ones down here, or is it the whole ankle as an L shape? So it's not really clear what this means, and therefore that it gives rise to various interpretations. So one interpretation is that as opposed to a peg or a door bolt that goes horizontally into the wall, that which is no good, Rabbi made it like a bolt that's on the top or bottom of the door. Nowadays also we have sometimes doors like a double door or a porch door, where for extra security you have a bolt that is attached to the door and goes up into the ceiling or down into the ground. And so that's the kind of bolt he was talking about, and that's what he means by ankle. He means the vertical part of the ankle. And therefore the idea is that a mezuzah cannot be laying down horizontally, but rather has to be put up and down vertically. And this would be the source and interpretation that Sephardim follow, that we place the mezuzah up and down. However, there are other interpretations that say, no, like an ankle means on an angle. And that might be the source for Ashkenazim, who put it on an angle, not vertical, not horizontal, but 45 degrees. And that would be the interpretation of an angle. Another interpretation that nobody does today is to make it like an L shape, that you put it, you can make a little hole into the wall and you press it in such that the top half is vertical and then it bends in the middle, and then the bottom half is more horizontal, which would be actually like an ankle. There is, however, another interpretation that flips these around completely and says when it's the peg that's not good is the one that would be like down into the floor. So that if it's vertical, it's not good at all. Rather, it's supposed to be like an ankle and more horizontal. And so that's the opposite interpretation, and that could be another different reason why Ashkenazim put it on an angle, not because like an ankle is like an angle, but rather because we're not sure if it should be vertical or horizontal, and therefore we're not going to do either one, because it could be that one extreme or the other is invalid. So they put it on an angle, and that way it's not one extreme or the other. So it's a kind of physical compromise between horizontal and vertical, putting it at 45 degrees. It is interesting that happens to follow the same way that these communities have their Sifrei Torah. Sephardim, who use Sefer Torah vertically in a case, also have the Mezuzot vertically. And Ashkenazim, who put their Sifrei Torah more horizontally, or really on an angle, when they put it on the teva, or they lean it inside the teva, so they have it more on an angle, so their mezuzot are more on an angle as well. There is definitely important similarity between mezuzot and Sifrei Torah. We saw that before. There was an analogy of kitibah and kitibah of sefer, and in addition, it is interesting that although the peshat, the simple reading of the pasuk uchtaftam al mezuzot might sound like you actually would write it as a plaque right onto the wall, and so you could walk by and you could read it right on there. But instead, we don't do that. We write it on parchment with many of the same laws as writing a Sefer Torah. So in a way, it is a kind of mini Sefer Torah, and therefore that would make sense that the orientation of the mezuzah would be similar to the orientation, the way that we would treat a Sefer Torah in the most respectful way in each community, either keeping it upright or lying it down, would be the same way that we treat a mezuzah. Anyway, all that comes from this sugya. We asked now about the other law, that in the house of Rabbi, he did not place a mezuzah in the Bet Midrash. Ini, we have a contradictory story. There was an entranceway that Rav Huna would use to go into the Bet Midrash, and he had a mezuzah there. So why? That was one that he regularly used. And Rav said, regarding mezuzah, you go by the most accustomed entranceway to a place. So it seems that although the halacha nowadays is that a Bet Midrash does not technically require a mezuzah, we put a mezuzah anyway on a Bet Knesset and Bet Midrash, but technically we say we don't need it, but it sounds like Rav Huna did think that he needed it. Some of the commentaries say maybe it was an entranceway that also to his home, that he lived in this entranceway was to Bet Midrash and to his home that was in the same place, and that's what it means Ragil ba. They went there regularly, not only for the Bet Midrash, but also because he lived there. So possibly it could be that. But we learned that if there's that the one of Rabbi, maybe he did agree that the Bet Midrash needs a mezuzah, but he didn't use that entrance. It wasn't a significant entrance, and so he didn't put a mezuzah there. Or if we say that that's one there where Rav Huna lived, so that's why he put a mezuzah there, but Rabbi did not live there, and so he did not put a mezuzah there. Next sugya, Amar Rabbi Zera, Amar Matana, Amar Shemuel, Mitzvah lahanicha betchilat shelish ha'alyon, ve'Rav Huna Amar magbiya min ha'karka tefach, marchik min ha'kora tefach, ve'chol ha'petach kulo kasher limzuzah. Where should one place the mezuzah vertically? Shemuel says that the mitzvah, which sounds like the best thing to do, is to place it within the top third of the doorway. So you go from top to bottom, you separate it into thirds, and then it's the beginning of the top third. So you take the marker of the third of the door from the top, and then right above that marker, that's where the mezuzah should be. Whereas Rav Huna said that you have to lift it off the ground at least one tefach, or make it one tefach from the top, from the lintel, but anywhere in between is fine. Don't put it all the way down on the floor. That's not nice. Not all the way on top, but anywhere between the top and low and bottom, tefach is permitted. Me'tibeh, we have a challenge. Magbiya min ha'karka tefach, marchik min ha'kora tefach, v'chol ha'petach kulo kasher lemzuzah. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yehuda, you see, is exactly the same words as Rav Huna. So it's clear Rav Huna is following Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda Tana, Rav Huna is Amora. Rabbi Yosef omer, ukshartam uchtavtam, ma keshira begova, af ketiva begova. Rabbi Yosef, however, looks at these pesukim that are back to back and makes an analogy between them, just like it says regarding tefillin, that you write them, you bind them on your arm. And where do we bind it on our arm? On the upper part of the arm, right? Not on the wrist, but up on the bicep. And so too, just like that's on the upper part of the arm, so too mezuzah has to be on the upper part of the entrance. So here's the question: Bishlama l'Rav Huna hu de'amar ke'Rabbi Yehuda, ela d'Shmuel De'amar keman lo ke'Rabbi Yehuda ve'lo ke'Rabbi Yosef. Rav Huna, we understand, fits exactly what Rav Yehuda said. Rav Huna and Rav Yehuda, right, say the exact same words. But Shemuel, who is he saying that? Who is he following? He's certainly not following Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yehuda says a wide range, all the way from the top tefach to the bottom tefach. And his words aren't exactly the same as Rabbi Yosef either. Rabbi Yosef just says the upper part. But he doesn't say anything about the top third or the bottom of the top third or anything like that. So who is he following? Amar Rav Huna bered Rav Natan le'olam ke'Rabbi Yosef. Umay techilat shelish ha'alyon deka'amar lehadchika shelo lehadchika min ha'kora shel ma'la yoter mishelish. In fact, he is following Rabbi Yosef, and when he says the beginning of the upper part of the upper third of the entranceway, what he meant is in terms of the maximum distance, that you should not make it further from the top beam more than a third down. but you could put it anywhere within the top third. So it doesn't have to be at the bottom of the top third, which is a very specific place and difficult to reconcile with Rabbi Yosef, but he means anywhere within the top third. And that fits with Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Yosef says, begova, up on the upper part. So anywhere on the upper part is okay. And in fact, it sounds like from his words, mitzvah, that the best thing to do is to put it, yes, betchilat, like in the beginning, at the bottom edge of the upper third, but it sounds like, in fact, you could put it anywhere in the top area. And just the mitzvah is the best thing to do up there, but as long as it's within the top third, that would be okay. And in that way, we have an interesting analogy between tefillin and a mezuzah. And in fact, if you think about it, there is, in fact, like a physical analogy where a mezuzah you put on the side, on the doorpost, and if you imagine the shape of a human being, similar to a door frame, you could imagine the top like that person's head like a lintel, and his arms would be like the door frame, like the door posts. And so putting it on the head is like the lintel, and putting the mezuzah on the door frame on the side is similar to a person putting the tefillin on his arm. אמר רבא, מצווה להניחה בטפח הסמוך לרשות הרבים. Rava says that one should place the mezuzah in the one tefach area that's closest to Reshut harabim. In other words, you should put it closer to the outside. If you have a very thick doorway, maybe the doorway is 2 feet thick, so you could technically put it anywhere, but the mitzvah, the best is to place it closest to the outside area. My tama, Rabbanan Amri, Kedesh Yifka ba mezuzah miyad. Rav Chanina Misura Omer, Kihechi de tintere. What's the reason? The sages say, so that you will encounter the mezuzah immediately. And every time you enter and you see the mezuzah, you will remember Hashem is one, we're committed to the mitzvot, and so you shouldn't have to wait till you go further in, but you want to have that reminder immediately. Rav Chanina from Suda says, so that it will protect the house. And if you have a protection, you want it to be in the entire house. If you move it further into the house, then that outside of the house will not be protected. You can think of it as physical protection. Rambam, of course, thinks that the mezuzah is not for physical protection, but rather spiritual protection from sinning by seeing it. And in that sense, it might be closer to what Abanan say, that you will see it immediately and you don't want to have to wait for that spiritual protection. אמר רבי חנינא, בורא שלא כמידת הקדוש ברוך הוא מידת בשר ודם. מידת בשר ודם מלך יושב מבפנים ועם משמרים אותו מבחוץ. מידת הקדוש ברוך הוא אינו כן. עבדיו יושבים מבפנים והוא משמרן מבחוץ, שנאמר, אדוני שומרך, אדוני סלך, על יד ימינך. רבי חנינא says, come and see that the ways of HaKadosh Baruch Hu are not the ways the same as the ways of a king of flesh and blood. When it comes to flesh and blood, a king sits inside his palace protected, and the guards are outside. Whereas HaKadosh Baruch Hu does not do so. Rather, his servants, that's us, are sitting inside, and he is outside protecting his people from outside of the door. As it says in Tehillim, Hashem is your keeper, your protector, he is your shade upon your right hand. And the Yad Yeminecha, that might be the source for the mezuzah being on the right side. Darash Rav Yosef Beret Rava Mishemeh de Rava Ha'amik la tefach pesula. Rav Yosef, in the name of Rava, the son of Rava, says in the name of Rava that if one made it a handbreadth deep, it's no good. So just now we're talking about making it a handbreadth towards the inside, towards the outside. But now we're talking about the hole that you make into the doorpost. That hole should not be too deep. If you're going to dig a few inches and put the mezuzah all the way in, then that's too far in. Rather, it should be, you can, nowadays usually we put it in a case and we attach the case on front, on top of the doorpost. But you don't have to do that. You can make a hole, which sounds like that's how they usually did it, into the doorpost, but the doorpost, that hole should not be more than a tefach deep. Lema mesayah le hinnicha befasin o shetala aleha malben. Im yesh sham tefach sarich mezuzah acheret. Ve'im lav eno sarich mezuzah acheret. Let's suggest that the following baraita supports the statement of Rava that if one placed the mezuzah in a wooden doorpost, patzin, you put it in the doorpost, or you placed a frame on top of it. In other words, that's the second one sounds like there was already a mezuzah, and then you put an added frame on top of it, and so now where the mezuzah was is farther away from the front of the frame. And so if there is a tefach of space from the surface of the frame, either the frame that was there or the new frame that you put on, if there's more than a tefach from the surface of the frame to where the mezuzah is, then you're going to have to place another mezuzah. But if not, if it's less than a tefach, then you do not need another one, even though it's you covered it up and now it's further recessed than it was before. It cannot be recessed more than a tefach. Okay, so that seems to support Rava, who said it can't be recessed more than a tefach. And here it's giving you two situations. Either you recessed it all the way, or at first it was not recessed so much, but then you added another layer of framing, and then it became more recessed. Okay, so that seems to support it. However, if you notice the language here, you need another mezuzah. That's strange. What do you mean? Why would you make another mezuzah to say, take that mezuzah out and put it in a less recessed cavity? What do you mean, another mezuzah? So in fact, we say, this baraita is talking about a different situation altogether. This is talking about an entrance that's behind a door, a kind of double entrance that you can see in a picture like this, where you have an entrance over here on the west side and then on the south side also. So imagine the mezuzah is over here on the right side of the south entrance. You have a mezuzah there. So now we're saying you have a mezuzah there, and the question is, well, can this mezuzah on the right cover both of these entrances? And the answer is it depends on whether this doorpost here that's between them is more than a tefach or less than a tefach. If it's less than a tefach, that's what it says over here. If it's le'im lav, then you don't need another mezuzah. This is just like a little post. Imagine if you had a big doorway and you had a little post in the middle of the doorway. So that's not considered a separate doorway. So you only need one mezuzah, and that covers the entire big entrance. However, if this doorpost is wider than a tefach, then it's considered two separate entrances, and that's why it says if it's more than a tefach, you need another mezuzah, you need another one on the right side of this western entryway. Okay, so that's what that baraita was talking about. It was not talking about how recessed the hole is. We ask about that. Ha behedya katanila petach shachorei hadelet im yesh sham tefach sarich mezuzah acheret ve'im lav eno sarich mezuzah acheret. Wait a second. That same baraita says this case explicitly. So we already know this case from another part of that baraita, where it says if you have an entranceway behind a doorway, another entranceway behind the door, and then it depends. If there is a tefach in that beam, then you need another mezuzah for that entranceway. But if not, if the beam is small, then you do not need another mezuzah. So we already know that law. So what is this part of the baraita coming to teach us? Maybe it's coming to teach us something like what Rava says about a recessed mezuzah. And the answer is no. Kesad kataneh. This part of the mezuzah is explaining the first part. First part gave you the general rule. If it's tefach, mezuzah, and so on. And then it says kesad. How so? What's the case? And explains the case in further detail. But in fact, it's talking about the same case. It's not talking about a recessed one, and therefore that baraita is not a proof for Rava's law. Tana. Ha'amid la malben shel kanim chotech shefoferet umanicha. Usually you make a door frame out of a piece of wood. But let's say you don't use a piece of wood, you use reeds. Take some reeds, put them together, and use that as the door post. Well, in that case, instead of making a hole in, like usually if it's just made out of wood, you'd make a hole, a recessed hole, and you put the mezuzah inside. But here, since it's made out of a bunch of reeds, so you're not going to just drill a hole in there. It would be more convenient to take one of the reeds, which is a tube, and cut it open, and then you can put the mezuzah inside the tube, inside the reed, and you place it there. It'll stay in place, and that's okay. אמר רב אחא ברד רבא, לא שנו אלא שהעמיד ולבסוף חתך והניחה, אבל חתך והניח לבסוף העמיד פסולה. תעשה ולא מן העשוי. Rav Achad, the son of Rava, says this only is valid if first you take the reeds and you place them in the door frame, and you put them in place, and then after that you cut the hole and put a mezuzah into that hole, into the tube. That's perfectly fine. However, if these reeds, while you're preparing them, they're still on the floor, on the table, and you're putting them together, and over there you cut it and put the mezuzah in, and then you take the reeds and attach them to the door frame, that is not permitted. That is not valid, because as ta'aseh, you have to put the mezuzah there, and not that it's already done passively. You actually, once the frame is up, you have to take the mezuzah and put it in the frame. And so this would apply also if it's made out of wood or whatever. It's a piece of wood that you're going to use as the door jamb. You can't take a mezuzah and put it in the piece of wood first and then put that wood attach it onto the wall. Rather, you have to attach it to the wall first and place the mezuzah onto the frame after the frame is attached to the wall. Ve'amar Rava, hane pitche shima'eh, piturim min mezuzah. Rava says that broken entrances do not need a mezuzah. What does that mean? My pitche shima'eh, peligi ba Rav Richumi ve'Abba Yoseh. Chadamar delet lehu tikra ve'chadamar delet lehu shakofeh. There's two opinions between Rav Richumi and Abba Yoseh. One of them said that it has no roof. Let's say you have a door or gate or something. It goes into a room or a space that has no roof. So that's not considered a room. And if it has no roof, then you don't need a mezuzah. And the other said it does not have a lintel. And that would be like this. Here's a broken entrance. There's just a break in the middle of a wall. But there's no door frame. There's no top to it. And therefore, that's not considered a mezuzah as a door frame. A door post doesn't have a lintel. And therefore, it does not need a mezuzah. Amar Rabba bar Shela, Amar Rav Chista. Ach sadra petura min ha-mezuzah lefi she'en la pasimin. Rabba, the son of Shela, says in the name of Rav Chista that a portico does not require a mezuzah because it does not have doorposts. Here's a portico, and so while yes, there is a roof over it and is a kind of a room, but there's no doorways, even though it has posts to hold up the ceiling, but that's not called a doorway, and therefore does not require a mezuzah. We ask, yesh la pasimin hayav? So that would mean that if there were doorposts, then it would be liable to a mezuzah. Lechezuk tikrahu de'abidi. Even if it has posts, that is only to hold up the ceiling. And so even if it has pillars like this, or some kind of doorpost, but that's only to hold up the ceiling. It's not a doorway, so even so, it should not require. And we explain, Hachi Kamar, Afal pi sheyesh la pasimin petura she'en asuyin ela lechizuk latikra. If you have a portico, even if it has posts, it still does not require a mezuzah because they're only made to hold up the ceiling, not to be a doorway. Amar Abaye, hazena lehu leis pelide debe mor deit lehu pasime velet lehu mezuzata kasabar lechizuk tikra hu de'abidi. Abaye said, we saw the portico of the master's house. His teacher was Rabbah, and Rabbah had a portico house, and it had these posts, and there was no mezuzah. And so we said we can learn from this that according to Rabbah, if you have a post but it's only there to hold up the ceiling and not to be a doorway, then it does not require mezuzah, as we just said. But we have a question. Me'tibe. Bet sha'ar, ach sadra, umirpeset, chayavin b'mezuzah. There's a braita that teaches that a gatehouse, here's an example of a gatehouse, it's a place where the guard would stay in there, and it's connected to the entranceway of a courtyard, and so that is a little house, but it requires a mezuzah, and a portico, and a balcony all require a mezuzah. So the question is from the achsadra here, the portico. So how could you say over here that a portico does not require it, but here this baraita says that a portico does require a mezuzah? We answer, b'achsadra de be'erav. When this baraita says that a portico requires a mezuzah, it's talking about the type of portico that's used as a bet midrash, which looks more like this. So it's kind of an outdoor area. It just has a lot of big windows and a big open space, but it does have four sides, and therefore that's the one that requires a mezuzah. We ask about that. Wait, the type of porticos that are used as a bet midrash, they're like full-fledged rooms, so obviously that requires a mezuzah. You wouldn't need a braita to tell me that. So rather we say b'achsadra romita. No, a Roman portico that, according to Rashi, looks something like this. It's open. It's very open, but it does have low walls, and because it does have walls on four sides and an opening, an entranceway, therefore this requires a mezuzah, even though it's very open, as opposed to Rav Chisda above when he said that it does not require achsadra, does not require mezuzah. That's talking about one that does not have walls on all the sides, like here, where this one only has a wall on one side. Even that is pretty open. But if you have a whole side that has no wall, even if it has a column to hold it up, that would not require a mezuzah. But these cases have a wall or a short wall, and that does require a mezuzah. Amar Rachava, Amar Rav Yehuda, Be'harziki haya b'shte mezuzot. Rachava says the name of Rav Yehuda that Be'harziki is a Persian word that seems to mean a prison. So this is some kind of structure that has a courtyard and a guardhouse, a gatehouse, and then these small rooms, these houses. It could be an actual prison or something that has a structure like this, which is kind of like a prison. And he says it requires two mezuzot. What is my be'harziki? What is a be'harziki? Amar Papa Saba Mishemeh Derav Bet Sha'ar Patuach Lechaser Ubatim Petuchim LeBet Sha'ar. It's Rav explains that's where you have a gatehouse, Bet Sha'ar, that's open to a courtyard. And there are also houses that are open to that gatehouse. So in this case, you would require a mezuzah, certainly in the houses, because you're going into the houses. And the chidush here is that you also need one that's going into the gatehouse, because the gatehouse is an entryway into the house, and therefore it takes on the same status. And so you would need two mezuzot, one for the gatehouse and another one for the house itself. Teno Rabbanan, Bet Sha'ar hapatuach legina ul kitonit. Now we have a variation on that case where you have a gatehouse that's open to a garden. We'll use this picture, even though this is a variation of the previous one about the courtyard, but this is a similar picture. And so you have here a garden. Now, if you had just an entrance to a garden, it would not require a mezuzah. And if you had just a gatehouse to a garden, also it would not require mezuzah, because the gatehouse is only to a garden, so you wouldn't need one. But here the complication is you will have a gatehouse that's connected both to a garden but also to a house. Now, if you had just a gatehouse that goes into a house, or in this case a little room, then you would require a mezuzah on both the home and the gatehouse, as we said above. But in this case, the problem is it's going into two different things. So how are we going to judge all this? So that's the question. Bet Sha'ar patuach legina ul kitonit machloket. Rabbi Yosef omer nidon kekitonit. Hachamim omrim nidon kebet Sha'ar. Rabbi Yosef says it is considered like the small room and requires a mezuzah. Chachamim say it's considered like just a gatehouse to a garden and does not require a mezuzah. Now we're going to see two different interpretations of this machloket between the Tanaim to say what exactly are they arguing out, which gateway are they do they have a difficulty with. Rav Shmuel damre tarvayhu migina labayit kula ama la peligi de hayav ma'itama bi'ah de bayit hi. Rav and Shmuel say that everyone agrees that in the entranceway that goes from the garden into the house, so in other words, this one that's in front of the house, everybody will agree that that requires a mezuzah because that's an entrance into the house. And so according to that miutzim, you need one going from the public domain into the gatehouse and the gatehouse into the house because the house is the primary place that you want to go. And so even this gatehouse is considered going into the gatehouse to get into the house. There's no machloket about that. According to Rav and Shemuel, everybody would agree to be Yosen Chachamim. Ki pelige mi bayit lagina, mor sabar kitonit ikar, umor sabar gina ikar. However, according to Rav and Shemuel, the machloket between the Biyoseh and Chachamim is about the entranceway from the house into the garden. In other words, this entranceway into the garden, where one, the Biyoseh, who is stringent, will say that the room is the main thing, and therefore you're required to put a mezuzah here because you're going from this garden, and the point of this entranceway is to go into the room, and not just into the gatehouse and outside, but rather into the inside room. So this is kind of like a gatehouse from the outside here, the garden, into the gatehouse to get into the room. So that requires a mezuzah. Whereas the others, the sages, Chachamim, say, no, the main point of this entranceway is for the garden, is to get out to the garden, not to go into the house. It's not like an entrance to the gatehouse to the house, but rather this is here so that you can get to the court, to get to the garden. And an entrance to a garden does not need a mezuzah. So we're thinking about it going out and does not require. That's all one version of the machloket. However, there's another opinion. Rabba v'Rav Yosef tamir tavayu mibayit lagina de kula amala pelige de patur ma'itama pitra de gina hu. According to Rabba and Rav Yosef, everybody agrees that an exit way that goes out to the garden, everybody agrees that Biyoseh and Chachamim does not require a mezuzah. Why? Because that's an entranceway to a exit to a garden, and an exit to a garden does not need a mezuzah. It has the same law as the garden. Rather, it's the other one, the path that goes from the garden into the house, the doorway into the house. Mor sabar bi'ade bayitu, or mor sabar kula adata digina hu de'abida. One opinion, the Biyoseh says, yeah, that's an entrance into the house, and therefore it requires a mezuzah. Hachamim, however, say that the purpose of the whole gateway is to get to the garden. In other words, if you didn't have a garden, you wouldn't need a gateway. You could just put a lock on the house, and that would be it. The only reason you have a gateway is because you want to have a way to get to the garden, and therefore, since this whole point of this whole thing is to get to the garden, so you have a mezuzah in the front when you come from the public domain, and then you don't need another mezuzah into the house because the gateway is here actually for the purpose of the garden, and since going into the garden doesn't need a mezuzah, neither do you need an additional mezuzah from the gateway into the house. That's at least one interpretation of this machloket. And halacha is Abaye v'Ravad Abdi Kerabba v'Rav Yosef. The later Amoraim Abaye and Rava, they followed the opinion of Rabban Rav Yosef. Rav Asher Abid Kerav Ushmuel lechumra. Hilchata Kerav Ushmuel lechumra. Rav Asher, however, followed the opinion of Rav and Shemuel, and they followed the stringent opinion of Rabbi Yosef. And according to that, you would need a mezuzah on all of those entrances. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen.